Hello, welcome to this second video for week 6 of New Testament Studies, module TMM2051. This video is entitled Framing Paul, and what I want to invite you to do is to think about what are the issues, what is the knowledge, what are the concepts, ideas, what's the history, what are the stories, and so on, that we need in order to be able to read Paul in his context. In other words, what can we know about Paul's context? And inevitably, describing our own world and our own historical context would be a vast task. And it would be an oversimplification, and it's of course going to be the same with the Apostle Paul. Because of that, I want to invite you to think about 4 frames of reference. The first, I want you to think about history. The second, I want you to think about religion. The third, I want you to think about ideas and philosophy. And then the fourth, I want you to think about cultural values. So, what would you need to know if you were interpreting somebody who was a 19th century Brit? Well, you'd need to know a little bit about British history. You'd need to know a little bit about religion, because religion was an enormous part of life at the time. You'd need to know a little bit about the ideas, at the very least the ideas that were current at the time, but also maybe a little bit about the ideas that predated them. So you'd need to know a little bit of history of ideas, and you'd need to know a little bit about values. What are the prevailing cultural values of that particular epoch? Because of course there is that old saying, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. And this is a useful exercise for us as interpreters, because actually becoming aware of the strange world of the Bible, that it's a world inhabited by people for whom the things that we think are obvious and clear aren't obvious and clear, and then the things that they think are obvious and clear seem, quite odd to us. That's a really interesting and useful exercise for us as interpreters, because once again it teaches us a modicum of humility. It teaches us not to universalize ourselves and assume that all right-thinking people agree with us. So what I want to do in this video is, in a short time, probably about 20 minutes, take you through a potted summary of some of the issues. I have a PDF handout that I'll distribute via the announcements forum. So I'll send round handouts in advance of the session. And so I'm going to put you on to my iPad screen, which shows the handout. So, framing Paul's mission in terms of history, and immediately you're given a complicated task, because of course history isn't just history; it's whose history. The diner and the dinner would tell a different story about the same meal, I'm sure. And it's the same with history, especially history in this period, because the history in this period is the history of great empires. The history of great empires. And so we might think to situate Paul's mission in terms of the history of Judaisms. And I say Judaisms in the plural because Judaism was a diverse phenomenon. And we'll look back on that in a moment. But we might also talk about Hellenism, and there's a real question as to what Hellenism is. And then there's the question of the Roman Empire. Anybody who has seen the life of Brian will immediately know what I'm talking about when I ask the question, what have the Romans ever done for us? And so there's at least three histories at play, and more in the in what we would frame Paul with. So let's go back to Judaism. The story of Judaism. Well, firstly, Judaism, or rather the religion of the Israelites, or the Judeans, has a much longer history than the history we're looking at, which is the history of what's called the Second Temple period. And in the prophetic literature and the historical literature of the Old Testament, we hear the story of exile. The Babylonians invaded 605 BC, destroyed the temple. The Babylonian exile began in 586 BC. Many Jews fled to Egypt, so there was a large Jewish population in Egypt. And then towards the end of that century, 538 to 515 BC, some Jews returned to Jerusalem. But of course the Babylonians weren't the only empire in that period. The Medes and Persians invaded the Middle East and in 536 BC, and the Second Temple was built in 516 BC. So the temple was rebuilt. Then in 332 BC, the Greeks invaded the Levant. Now, why, we might ask, is the Levant, the Holy Land, so prone to be invaded? Well, one of the things that I'm going to scoot forward to the map, we can see on this map that actually the Holy Land is a land bridge between Greece and Asia Minor in the top left corner of that map, and Africa, Arabia, and actually it's a decent stopping off place on the way to Persia. It's strategically important. It's a land bridge. If Egypt wanted to go to war with anybody else, Israel was the land they had to travel through. If the Arameans wanted to go to war with anybody else, that's the land that they had to go through, and so on. And so the Greeks invaded as part of a broader invasion of Egypt and Persian territories. And the Persians were defeated in 332. And then there was a Greek period. So already we've had a Babylonian period, a Medo-Persian period, and a Greek period. Around 250 BC, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, was made. That is interesting, that's important, because that shows that there was an attempt to translate the Hebrew scriptures into the language of, the imperial ruling class. And that perhaps tells us something about the relationship between Greek-speaking and Hebrew-speaking groups in this time. Then we've also got Judea was conquered and annexed to Syria by the Seleucids. Now we need to know a little bit about the history of the Greek period, and we're coming to that in a moment. Um, but in summary, from in response to that annexation and certainly the behaviour of the Seleucids, there was a revolt um, by the Judeans, particularly in response, and that's called the Maccabean Revolt, and that dates to 165, and that was a largely successful guerrilla war against a wannabe imperial overlord. And there was a period of partial independence. I say partial because there was some external support from other empires. And the Jews experienced partial independence. Local kings were reinstituted, and we've got there the lineage of the Maccabean and Hasmonean kings. So these are the kings of the Jews in the period of partial independence. Then in 63 BC, the Romans invade, and direct rule is imposed progressively over different parts of the Holy Land, really from 4 BC onwards. So there are parts of the Holy Land are still under Judean governance, parts of the Holy Land are under direct governance, and gradually the whole area is hoovered up. But we see elements of this in Luke's description of Paul's ministry, where Paul is passed back and forth for a while between the Roman governor of Judea and one of the Herods. You see elements of this in the crucifixion account of Jesus, where Pilate and Herod pass Jesus back and forth between them. At the end of what's called the Tetrarchy, direct rule is assumed over the whole. Direct Roman rule is assumed over the whole of the province. In AD 70, there is another revolt. Jerusalem is largely destroyed, and the Second Temple is brought to an end. And so, we might want to say that some of the basic ideas of Judaism in this time will be around national identity and the relationship between observance and membership of an empire that doesn't worship your God. Certainly you can see evidence of that in some of the writings of the Old Testament, for instance, Daniel or Esther, where the challenge is for Jews who are living in exile, how do we live in exile? And the same sorts of issues are at play, though in a different way, in the long periods of occupation. And so national identity and faithfulness to the one God, as well as control over the symbols of one's culture, like the temple, the priesthood, the kingdom. These are all really terribly important aspects of Jewish identity in this period. And we've got to factor them in as being part of Paul's motivations. Certainly before his calling to follow Jesus Christ, and quite possibly in various different ways after. So let's move on and think about Hellenism. I'm going to have to pick up the pace because we're on 15 minutes. Hellenism refers to the cultural influence that remained in the territories of the Mediterranean that were conquered by the Macedonian Greeks under Alexander the Great. So let's think about that Greek period. The Greeks invade, the Persians defeated. Well, Alexander didn't get to live with his conquests for very long. BC 323, I think he died, and upon his death, his empire fragmented and was ruled by his generals, with Ptolemy taking Egypt, a different set of generals taking various territories in Asia Minor, and with the territory of Persia and Syria being ruled by a group that later came to be known as the Seleucids. And so the Seleucids aren't distinct from Greek rule. They're the remnants of Alexander's empire in that area. Now, it might be helpful for us to think in terms of colonialism at this point, and think about well, what did Greek rule mean for Greek territories? Well, what it meant that the ruling class spoke Greek, wore Greek, worshipped Greek, ate Greek. Their customs were Greek. It meant that anybody who wanted to get on would want to be able to give a passable interpretation of Greek customs. It meant that there was a kind of hierarchy of cultures and customs in those territories, in a way that's analogous to the way in which Anglo customs became a kind of elite set of customs in the former territories of the British colonial empire, particularly in India, where you'd almost have dual sets of customs, with the elite tending to gravitate towards English customs, Anglophone customs, speaking English, worshipping English, and so on and so on and so on. And it's the same in the Greek territories, in the territories conquered by Alexander the Great. They left behind them a cultural elite which did precisely that kind of Greek overlaying of local cultures, and placed sub-elite locals in the unfortunate position of having to become more Greek in order to get along, of speaking Greek, and so on. And you can see that might be one of the reasons, that might be one of the dynamics that fed into the translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. It would certainly also be one of the reasons. It would certainly be one of the reasons why the Seleucids, when they conquered the Levant, tried to impose Greek customs on the people who lived there, including the worship of Greek gods. Why can't you just worship our gods alongside your own? You can imagine them saying that. And so actually this is a period in which, in distinction from Hellenism, the monotheistic aspects of Judaism became really very prominent. And there you can see the various territories of the Alexandrian Empire broken down into Macedonia, Thrace, the Seleucid Empire, and in pink the Ptolemaic Empire. So let's talk a little about the Roman Empire. And there we've got the Roman Empire is a much bigger territory. It overlaps the area of Hellenistic influence in that it doesn't go all the way into Persia. The Persian Empire was resurgent at this time, and it grew in this period. And so I'm going to try and expand that area there. So the stuff in red was under Roman control in 100 BC. The stuff in yellow was brought under Roman control at the time of Julius Caesar's death. As you can see, the African campaigns and parts of Asia Minor. And then you can see that direct Roman rule was imposed on all of the green areas during the time of Augustus. And that overlaps with the time of New Testament writing. The ministry of Jesus occurred at a time of Roman expansion in the Levant. The ministry of Paul occurred at a time when the Romans were consolidating some of their acquisitions. And so we might think about multiple layers of elite culture layered over each other. So there's a Hellenistic world which bears the imprint of Greece, and then there's the Roman political entity which layers itself over the top and tries to hoover up some of the prestige of the Greek culture. All of this is grist for the mill for interpreting Paul, because of course Paul's ministry occurred in Galatia, in areas that were recently under imperial control, in Ephesus, in areas that had been under Roman control for a while, in Corinth, in a Roman colony that had been rebuilt after being destroyed 100 years earlier by the Romans, and up and down the Greek peninsula, and ultimately to Rome itself. And so Paul's ministry overlaps. It's the ministry of a Jewish Jesus devotee who inhabited a Hellenistic world and may very well have been a product of that world, that was governed by a resurgent Roman Empire. And so that's quite a complicated interpretative situation. The post-colonial scholar Homi Bhabha talks about third space identities as a way of talking about what it is to be a hybrid, fully inhabiting many different worlds at once. And we might think about Paul as being that sort of person. Not cosmopolitan, that isn't the same thing. Rather, somebody who could be fully Jewish, but somebody who could also be fully Roman and fully Hellenistic in all sorts of interesting ways that interact with his Jewishness and also interact with his Jesus movement identity too. So let's think about religion. I've already mentioned that the Hellenistic and the Roman worlds were not irreligious. They had a religious aspect to them. And Paul alludes to some of this in 1 Corinthians 8, though there may be so-called gods in heaven or on earth, as in fact there are many gods and lords, yet for us there is one. So who are these many gods and lords? Well, this is a whistle-stop tour. we might think of the traditional Greco-Roman pantheon, the civil religion of both the Greeks and the Romans, and they overlapped a lot, both in terms of their underlying stories and in terms of their basic identities. We might also think of so-called new gods and mysteries. One of the interesting things, as we saw in the Roman Empire map, is that the Romans acquired a lot of territory. And of course, one of the things that happens when you acquire territory, and the various European colonial projects found this out, is that you go to a part of the world and then you discover they don't live like you. And then you have to try and make sense of your own world, of your own views in the light of theirs, as well as making sense of theirs in the light of your own. And the Romans found this as well. The various Eastern acquisitions of the Roman Empire brought with them gods. In Galatia, they were great worshippers of a god called the Magna Mater, the Great Mother, the Sibyls, and they had practices that were adopted by the Romans, including the imperial family, who were great devotees of the Magna Mater. Sometimes the new gods weren't imports like Isis from Egypt, who was worshipped a great deal in Corinth. Occasionally the new gods were minor figures in the stories of the old gods, and they were elevated to positions of greater importance and devotion because they were kind of a god that was slightly closer than the distant Olympians. So we might think about Asclepius, the healer divinity, who was the son of Apollo, or Dionysius, the god of wine, who was the son of Zeus. But in terms of the imported gods, we might think of Isis, the wife of Osiris, who's an Egyptian goddess, the Sibyls, the Great Mother, who was originally a Phrygian deity, and then Mithras, who was originally a Persian deity and was popular among the Roman military. Of course, one of the things that we have to think about is this idea called syncretism. If you've ever been to Bath, round here they call it Bath, you'll go to the pools at Bath and you'll discover that they're dedicated to Minerva or Sulis. Now, Minerva is the name of the Roman god. Sulis is the name of the local British god. And the Romans basically came along and said, oh, your god does the same as Minerva, so let's call them Minerva Sulis. And you find that this practice of rocking up in places and basically just saying, yes, this is what you do, these are the names that we use, it's all the same, it's all good, that's a practice called syncretism. And what's really interesting is that the Jews tended to resist it quite vigorously. They weren't happy for their God to be one God among many. Their God was unique, and not only unique, but the only God. And the Christians, for the most part, followed them. And so syncretism was interesting, because of course there are examples in Greco-Roman magical texts in which Greco-Roman practitioners of occult practice would try to invoke the god of the Hebrews alongside a whole series of other deities. And there are examples of that, or there are examples of things that are similar to that in Luke and Acts when people try to cast out demons in the name of Jesus whom Paul preaches. We might also talk about the imperial cult. This is complicated, this is difficult. And this is the practice of sacrificing to the emperor. Well, or is it? Because in the West, the imperial family pretty much insisted that the sacrifices weren't to the emperor, they were to the genius, the spiritual power that lay behind the empire, personified in the emperor, but not identified directly with him. In the East, they pretty much just identified the emperor as a god king. And Jews were generally exempt from this as a concession, and for a limited period so might Christians have been. But it's worth thinking about in relation to some of the things Paul says, because one of the traditional acclamations of the imperial cult was Caesar Kurios Estin, Caesar is Lord. What's the central proclamation of the gospel according to Paul? Jesus Kurios Estin, Jesus is Lord. It's just worth pointing out that Paul already worshipped a god king. And that immediately situates the early Christians in a position of some tension with the imperial cult, because you might imagine yourself as a Jesus devotee who also happens to be a Gentile. Are you entitled to the exemption that Jews had, or not? It's only a little bit of incense. Will it really hurt? These are important considerations about how Jesus devotees would live as inhabitants of the Roman Empire. Let's think also about philosophy. Paul alludes to some of this in 1 Corinthians. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Hasn't God made foolish the wisdom of the world? Jews demand signs and Greeks desire wisdom, but we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. So it would probably be helpful to know a little bit of a little bit about the ideas that make up the standard curriculum of an educated or relatively educated Greek or Roman. And in the handout, which I'll email out via the announcements facility, you'll see that some of the ideas were current. Sorry, you'll see some of the ideas that were current. Platonism, specifically in this period, a tradition called Middle Platonism. Pythagoreanism, Epicureanism. Now, Epicurus gets a lot of bad press because he's portrayed as basically being a bit of a libertine when in reality he wasn't quite as he's been presented. And then one of the most dominant traditions in the Roman Empire, Cynicism and Stoicism. To give a brief summary of these, and this is a monstrous oversimplification, but Plato was a dualist. He believed in another world. Pythagoras was really obsessed with what's the foundational reality of all that is. Epicurus is is really a tradition which regards life as ultimately transient, and when you die, that's the end of it, and therefore you need to learn how to live with pleasure and friendship in the world as it is. Cynicism and Stoicism are about, they would describe it, living in accordance with nature. What's the right way for human beings to live? And so they're very, very, very interested in ethics and how we might live properly as rational human beings in the world. And we can see elements of similarity and difference between things that Paul might say. Paul believed in another world. Not a dualistic world, but the world of the future when God would remake the cosmos. He did believe in a foundational reality, but that reality was mediated by Jesus Christ. He believed that life was transient, but that God would, at the end of the age, raise people to new life, and therefore that what we did in the present had meaning. There was more than just pleasure. And he also based a lot of his practical ethics on a double focus, looking partly to the future, but also partly back to the biblical creation accounts, which he took to be an indication of what an ideal world, or rather what human beings ought ideally to do. And so there would have been elements of similarity and difference between Paul and all of these great philosophical traditions. Lastly, we need to think about cultural values. And one of the most obvious cultural values in the ancient Near East, in the ancient world generally, is honour and shame. And Paul alludes to it. Pay to all what is due. Taxes, to whom taxes are due. Revenue, to whom revenue is due. Respect, to whom respect is due. Honour, to whom honour is due. There are social values and codes in the ancient world, in the ancient Mediterranean and in the ancient Near East. And these differed in detail, but in broad brushstrokes, they were immensely similar. Because antiquity is obsessed with honour and shame. And the question is, what is honour? Well, it's a type of prestige. It's your standing. You know your value, your peers know your value, and everybody is obliged to recognise it. And if it's not recognised, then you're insulted. And it's important to recognise that honour and shame societies tend to regard honour as being more important than money. It's much more important to be honoured by people. And it's also important to remember that honour isn't individual. It belongs to the group. It might be centred on individual people. Patriarchs tended to hold the honour, and subordinates tended to put honour at risk. Hence, men in the ancient world tended to have all sorts of mechanisms for socially controlling their women, their children, and their slaves. But the honour itself belonged to the group. And that's an important distinction for us to make, because in the modern world we think patriarchy is something which is centred on individual men, whereas in the ancient world patriarchy is the value that attached to men as the bearers of honour on behalf of entire kin groups. That might seem to us like a meaningless distinction, but to them it meant a lot, because you didn't just bear your name as an individual, you bore your name on behalf of an entire family and a patron. So who you honoured and who you dishonoured could bring all sorts of difficulties. And of course, part of the complexity of honour and shame was giving gifts. We all know that difficulty at Christmas time. A Christmas card comes in from somebody that we haven't given one to, and then we have to schlep out in the cold and buy another Christmas card because gifts have to be reciprocated. Well, gifts are complicated in honour societies because how you give makes someone your client, or it could make them your friend, or it could make them your patron. How you give and how you receive is terribly, terribly important for all sorts of obligations. And so I'd invite you to read that in the handout. Then there's also the question of how honour and shame interact with propriety, purity, and the use of space. Honour and shame societies usually have a very strong sense of boundaries. And this is about limiting the danger that comes from certain types of social interaction. One example would be if a woman who was married was outside, she would wear a physical boundary over her head as a way of signalling that she wasn't available for viewing. That was less to do with her own sense of comfort or discomfort and more to do with a social obligation that attached in that society to her being the wife of a particular husband. It was to do with honour and shame. Now, here's a really interesting question. If the Pauline churches worshipped in houses, as some scholars think that they did, what happens when the private space of a house becomes the semi-public space of a church meeting, and you've got people who aren't family coming to join? Should a woman put her veil on, or should she leave it off? What does Paul think? It may be that some of these ideas give some sort of light on some of the passages in 1 Corinthians that talk about how women behave in church. It may be that they're less commands that are attached to church and more are issues to do with tensions that arise when domestic space is used as church space. That might be the case, it might not. Anyway, we've had a whistle-stop summary of really 4 issues in the interpretation, well, in the framing of Paul. There's history, there's religion, there's ideas, and there's social values and practices. I'm going to stop there, so I'm going to put back on full screen. Thank you for listening. The video was a good deal longer than I'd anticipated, but please do take the time to watch it in chunks if that is helpful for you. In the meantime, as always, if you've got questions, please take a note of them and bring them with you to our Zoom seminars on Wednesday next. Okay, nice to see you. Bye-bye.